Hi, everybody. Well, first of all, can you hear me okay? My mic is on, isn't it? Okay, good. So thank you so much for inviting me back. You know I love you. I love coming to talk to you. And I learn a lot when I talk to you. Not only because I have to prepare myself to talk about a subject matter that may not be my area of expertise, and so I have to really dive into stuff, which is, you know, it's what I became a professor to be, is somebody who explores and continues to learn. So you give me that opportunity every time you say, oh, come back and talk about this or that. But I also learn about you. I actually have one of my students here. I don't know where she is. She's an undergrad. There she is, Susan. And she was walking over here with me, and I said to her, I said, the thing about talking to this group, Susan, because, you know, she's like, how old are you, Susan? She's 20, right? So I said, like, the mean age, you know, much higher. I said, but they often teach me. They usually kind of stop me and say, well, Karen, that's actually, you know, you're not quite right about that. Or, you know, here's another view. And I learn. So let me just start off by saying thank you. All right. So I'm not even going to preface it. Let's just get right into talking about death. And first, can I just ask, if I stand over here, am I still visible or no? Or you really want me to stand in front of the podium? Okay. Yeah? Okay. But then you can't see my cute little death tights. Okay. Okay. So let me just start off with a little bit of levity. Okay? I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Right? You've heard of this. And I think it exemplifies a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, which is that we're just too afraid to talk about it when it's the most natural thing on the planet. And I think I once told this group a funny story about me teaching to 300 undergrads. About 5 years ago, when I teach to this big class, it's a neuroscience class of 300 undergrads, I decided to start every lecture with a mindful moment. And it's usually not very contrived. It's usually like as I'm walking over to give the lecture, it's kind of what comes up for me. And I share it with the group. It's usually about 2 or 3 minutes before I start the official lecture. And this one day, sort of off the cuff, I don't know what was in my mind, but I started out and I looked at a class of 300 and I said, everyone in this room is going to die. And as I said that, you could feel energetically that 300 people had just looked at me as if I had insulted their mother. Like, they actually looked mad at me. And I was so shocked by them looking mad at me that I sort of looked back at them like, are you kidding me? And then they kind of looked back at me like, oh yeah, why was I mad? And all of that happened like within 2 seconds, that interplay. And it was fascinating to me. You know, it was my first experience, not my first, you'll learn later that it's not my first experience of coming across as confrontational simply because I want to talk about something very real and very important. You know, I've been, you know, there's other topics I've come and talk to you about where I've just, you know, called a spade a spade. And if you know what lecture I'm talking about, then you'll laugh. Okay, so let me start off with a little bit of personal history. You guys know I'm from New York Jew. And when I was very young, around 7 or 8, I used to sit in bed at night awake contemplating death. I don't know if you can guess which person in this image is the person who's likely to sit up in bed contemplating death. But this is me. And I laughed when I found this picture of me last night because I'm like, I could actually be Dostoevsky's daughter. Like, that's sort of the level of like troubled I was. So let me tell you what it was about lying up in bed at night that kept me awake about death. I wasn't actually afraid of dying. I was afraid about what happened after death. And in my mind, because I had a very logical mind from a young age, I saw there being 2 possibilities, and they were both equally scary to me. The first possibility is that after death, you just disappear. You're gone forever. And that was pretty scary. But the alternative was equally scary. And the alternative was that I would go on to like a heaven or an afterlife and live forever in that state. And literally the word forever, either way, it's like I'm gone forever or I'm here forever, was overwhelming to me as a kid. It was such a big concept, this idea of time being forever, that I could be forever, that I felt really small. I think I remember feeling small. And I think at that point in my life, I was already getting a sense of the fact that I had to deal with the fact that I am insignificant. There's something about me that's so small against this big, big question. So the question is, what do you do about feeling small and insignificant? And I know it doesn't sound like we're about to talk about death, but we are. Because the thing is, the answer to, how do we make ourselves not feel insignificant is that we spend a lifetime trying to make ourselves feel significant, to look for significance in the face of death. And I'm certainly not the first person to bring this up. Philosophers have been talking about this since the beginning of time. In preparation for knowing I was going to give this talk, I've always been reading books. If you've heard me talk before, I've read so many books throughout my lifetime that are about mindfulness and love and breakthrough and transformation. And I've also read my fair share of death books. But guess which book I read that really I felt like if I'm going to give a talk on death, then this is the book I have to really read before I come and talk to them. It's in the title. Being Mortal. Oh, Being Mortal is good too, but no, this one's really heavy. No, I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Yeah. Come on, you guys. It got a Pulitzer Prize. Please. No. This is back in the 50s, 60s. No. Hello, Ernest? Yeah, raise your hand if you've read this book. I got to tell you, so I spent months poring over this book. And it is a hard book to read. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, he wrote it. Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist. And he ended up getting colon cancer and writing this book while he was dying. And it won the Pulitzer Prize after his death. And I understand why it won the Pulitzer Prize. It is a hard read. It's him trying to synthesize and integrate the work of all of the big thinkers that came in the 1800s, like kind of at the end of the Enlightenment period, which was mostly like the 1700s. There was this kind of shift in the 1800s where people started talking about the psyche, the deep subconscious selves that we are. And of course, Freud gets all the credit for getting that off the ground with psychoanalysis. And then there's the post-Freudian people like Jung and Adler and Otto Rank. And there's Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. You know those heavy hitters that I'm talking about, or you've read them or you've heard of them. And basically what he did is he synthesized all of their opinions of death into one book. So it's a heavy read. And if you haven't read it, I'm going to kind of summarize a few major points from the book. It's in the title of the book, which is Humans Try to Deny Death Will Ever Happen to Them. We're kind of in this state of denial. So much so that we're insulted when somebody says you're going to die one day. Like, how dare you, And the idea is that because we don't want to accept it, we, instead of having like an honest conversation, like what does death mean to you? What do you think it's going to be like? How do you want it to be for you? We distract ourselves. So a lot of this book is not really, it's about death, but it's about how we distract ourselves from death. And just to name a few things that might sound familiar to you as ways to distract ourselves. Accumulating material success, thinking that if I get a lot of material stuff, it'll keep me busy, how much time we spend being busy so that we don't have to slow down and go like, oh, this is heavy stuff, like I felt when I was 7, 8 years old. By refining our personalities. I could talk all day about that, So what do I mean by your personality? Because whenever I talk about the personality as a negative thing, like a mask, because Becker certainly talks about your personality as a mask that you wear. People kind of go like, I like my personality. What's wrong with my personality? I want to keep my personality. I'm like, that's fine. Keep your personality. You spend a lifetime creating a personality and an identity. But just on some level, understand that it's not deeply who you are. It's a bit of a mask, and it's the way we have to get in, we have to make progress in the world. People have to know who you are. They have to know what you like and what you don't like. What you want, what you don't want, what you believe in, what you don't believe in. That's what I mean by refining your personality. And again, I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm just asking you to have a little bit of an awareness that it's a bit of a mask. It's the kind of identity that we build for ourselves. And it keeps us busy and distracted from the fact that we are these conscious beings that are much bigger than our personalities. And then the third thing is, like, I could give a whole lecture on this, fighting to stay young or look young. And you all know what I'm talking about. Because I do it too. I dye my roots. Why am I dyeing my roots? right? We even try to make death look pretty. And Ernest Becker talks about that. A lot of the big heavy hitters talk about how we try to make death look pretty. And in preparing this lecture, I had actually forgotten about another milestone in my journey of death exploration. So I told you when I was very young, I'd sit up and think about death and how terrifying it was that I was going to go on forever, either as permanently gone or permanently here. But I had my first encounter with death when I was 18. My grandfather died when I was 18. And, for those of you who are Jewish, the Jewish funeral looks like, it's a closed casket, except for the immediate family who gets to see the deceased. And I remember seeing my grandfather in the casket and hardly recognizing him because he looked so pretty. He was so perfect. And he had a three-piece suit on, and there were these jewels that were in with him, and his watch and a nice necklace. And he looked so perfect, much more perfect than he did when he was alive. And after the funeral, you go to the cemetery, and the immediate family walks in procession, kind of one behind the other, and you walk up to the open grave, and then there are prayers that are said, and then you take a shovel and you take dirt and you pour it, the immediate family puts dirt onto the grave. And it was very, it really affected me as a kid. And I wrote a poem about it when I was that age. And I'm going to read you the poem. I'm going to read it from a piece of paper as opposed to looking at the screen, but the words are up here. Now, I called it July Parade because something about it felt like a parade to me. And it's also about trying to make death look pretty, because at that age, I also was thinking about, I didn't even know I was thinking, it just came out in a poem, that it seemed bizarre to me that we kind of just don't talk about the darkness of death. So you ready for my poem? Okay. Cut stone, cold, row after row. I walk between them in parade, with the July sun behind me catching a corner of my face, impaled upon my thick, hot hair. A gentle breeze lifts my skirt, and my mother's skirt, and my sister's skirts in unison. Eyes fixed upon the darkness ahead. We cannot escape the darkness. We put it away in boxes, wrapped with jewels and pictures and a beautiful three-piece suit. We put it away and cover it with dirt, and the darkness passes out of sight. The parade turns about face, marching with slow motion, wilted heads and wet faces, going back to shining cars whose air conditioning shelters us. And beyond the gate, a soul cries out its last song. So this is how it felt to me, but I never really had the outlet. I think I read this to my family at the time, and they said, "Oh, that's a beautiful poem," but that was it. Not like, "Oh, Karen's thinking about this pretty seriously." There just wasn't the form for that when I was growing up. The other major point of the Denial of Death book, of course, it's about the fact that humans deny that they're going to die. They're not really able to look at it. But he talks about humans being in a predicament. And I often, when I give my workshops, because, I lead these mindfulness workshops, I talk about the human predicament. And I say the human predicament is that we're half animal and we're half divine. We're the only animal that has the ability to think about the fact that we think. We're the only animals that have a consciousness to understand that we die. So what a predicament to be in, because in many ways we're just like animals. And this book talks a lot about that, and Freud and Jung and all the heavy hitters had a lot to say about the fact that we are creatures. The term was creatureliness, that we can't handle our creatureliness. And all of the anal phase in Freud's psychodevelopment is about the fact that at some point you realize that you have an anus and that you defecate from it and it's stinky and that you're an animal and it's gross, and you have to kind of reconcile that creatureliness with the fact that you're divine, that you have a symbolic self. So I call it the divine self. Becker tends to call it the symbolic self, the conceptual self. But it's the part of you that's expansive. Divine, has a godlike responsibility to make choices because you know better, because you know how to think things through. And the way to say it, I'm going to give you a quote by him in a second, but the idea is like we're aware of the fact that we are these like ever, this kind of ethereal being of consciousness. We get that. But then it's very confusing that this conscious experience, which feels ethereal and almost immortal, is encased and limited by this body, which has limitations and decays and dies. So that's the predicament. We don't really know what to do with those two things. So there's a quote that captures it. He says, "What does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, a consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, and excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And with all of this, yet to die. It seems like a hoax." So he was, the book is it's a pretty heavy book. This is the way he's talking throughout the book. He tries to paint a slightly optimistic picture by talking about being a hero. So Becker had a lot to say about the human urge to be a hero. When he talked about, I could give a separate lecture on that sometime, but he talked about different types of hero, religious heroes, cultural heroes, a personal hero. And then he talked about a final hero called the genuine hero, which he thought was the only real hero. And I'll explain the genuine hero in a moment. But so why do humans try to be a hero? It's back to that question I asked before about trying to find significance. You know you're going to die, and so you try to do something that immortalizes yourself. And Freud called this an immortality project. Not Freud, sorry. Becker called this an immortality project. They were all looking for ways to stay immortal. And you can joke like, well, that's why people try to get their name on buildings, and they want to get their name associated with something, and because then you can live forever, or you become like a rock star, so people don't forget you. Basically, as long as you end up in Wikipedia, you're good. And this is our striving to be significant, to make our symbolic, conceptual self live forever. But he thinks this is destined to failure because this is not, because really what he's saying throughout the book is you need to face your death as opposed to coming up with these ways to repress thinking about death. Even his genuine hero, which he thinks is the only way to be a hero, sounds pretty grim. And I'll give you the definition. Here's how he describes what the genuine hero has to do. All right? I think that taking life seriously means something such as this, that whatever man does on this planet has to be done in the lived truth of the terror of creation, of the grotesque, of the rumble of panic underneath everything. Otherwise, it is false. So this is the life of the genuine hero who basically realizes that you're doomed from the beginning, and you have to kind of accept that. And so do I recommend this book or not is the question. I think it's a really important book for a lot of reasons, one of which is that he's really just following in the footsteps of the other downers out there, like Freud and Jung and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. They were all these really heavy thinkers, that all kind of describe man as sort of doomed and dark. So he does a great job, Becker, of bringing all of those together and helping us understand them in the current age. So for that reason, I think it's worth reading. But is there a less grim view? And so I'm switching gears to talk about a less grim view. And I'm going to start by talking about the obvious, which is religions. Now, I'm not an expert in religions, but I'm going to, and we have a whole hour to talk this through after my talk. But if I were going to summarize roughly what each religion says about death, it goes something like this. So you have the Christians who clearly talk about a heaven and hell. They clearly talk about an afterlife, and after you die, you're going to one or the other, or maybe you've got limbo or purgatory, those other like little, places of temporary placement. I don't know exactly how it goes. But that, there's definitely an afterlife if you're Christian. Now, I'm going to put up Jews and Muslims. Now, I'm Jewish, and all my life, and I just talked to my dad about this before I came over here, both religions are a little bit agnostic about the whole heaven and hell thing. It's not quite as clear as in Christianity. What they both have in common, Jews and Muslims, is they do believe that there's going to be a judgment day that's coming. and that when that day comes, the Jews think it's going to come, that Judgment Day comes when what they think the real Messiah, when that real Messiah comes, because the Jews don't accept Christ as the Messiah. And the Muslims think that Allah will, at the end of the world, when the world self-destructs, Allah is going to come and make a final judgment on everybody who's dead and make a decision about whether they get resurrected or not. So there is a sense of resurrection in both Judaism and Islam. And in fact, in Judaism, it's quite literal, the resurrection. The idea that you will come back into your body and get your body back. And that's why Jews are told not to, what are we told not to do during our lifetime? To not cremate and to not donate organs. Because for those of you who are not Jewish, the idea is that if you're going to be resurrected and get your body back, you have to not be cremated and you have to not have donated any organs. And I'm sorry to laugh at that, but ever since I was little, I said to my mom and dad, I'd say if there's a God, he's really not going to I'm not going to be resurrected because I gave my liver to somebody. He'll give me a new liver, I'll be fine, So again, the Muslims have a similar story, and both religions do talk about an afterlife, but you get the point. This is really interesting. The Buddhists and the Hindus and the Jains are a very ascetic version of Hindus. If anyone ever been to a Jain temple in India, they're beautiful. They really they ascribe to asceticism. But otherwise, they're quite similar to the Hindus and the Buddhists. Now, what all three of these have in common that's different from Judaism and Islam and Christianity is they believe in the cycle, the birth-death cycle, reincarnation. So they think that at the end of your life, you either get reincarnated and have to go through this again and again until you're ready to stop the birth-death cycle, or if you're ready to stop the birth-death cycle, you end it all. You end that birth-death cycle with nirvana. And nirvana actually means blown out. It means your life is finally blown out. You're done with this material world. And in these religions, there's a word samsara. It's a Sanskrit word, and it means of this world, of this material world, and it's a negative. It's sort of, samsara has associated with the fact that this world, this material world that we live in, has a lot of attachments and greediness and desires, and we're still acting like animals. Our animal selves are dominant in samsara. And the idea is that, well, like I said before, we're half animals, we're half divine, but with enough practice of going through this samsara over and over, you finally get more and more enlightened. You get more and more in touch with the fact that you're not an animal, that you are a conceptual self, a being that can live on in consciousness, but you have to be willing to get to that point and reach nirvana and not have to come back into the birth-death cycle. You have to, during your life here, reach a deep understanding that all of it, the material success, the refining of your personality, how young you look, that all of that is kind of an illusion, that none of that is really your true self. And that if you can reach that point of deep, true understanding, which is enlightenment, then you don't have to come back to this miserable world anymore. You get to fly off, and they're not really clear about where you fly off to, but you're sort of saved from having to come back and live. So it's interesting, right? Because here in the other religions, you got oh, please let me come back. I hope I come back. I want to be resurrected. And in these Eastern religions, it's please, don't let me come back here. It's too much. It's too hard. And then if I have time later, I'll say more about Tibetan Buddhism, because they have a very interesting take on exactly what happens at death. We'll see if we have time for that. So I love serendipity. I love how life works. I just love that the night before I'm giving this talk, one of my students in this, I'm teaching a science and mindfulness class right now, and one of my students at the end of class yesterday, it wasn't Susan, it was someone else, said, oh, Professor Dobkins, have you ever seen this movie? I think this Netflix show, it's called The Good Place. And she said, I think you'd really like it. So has anyone seen The Good Place? So last night, I decided, we've been working on this lecture a long time. I'm going to just take a break and watch the first episode. And not only is it really interesting, and I'll give you the premise of it, but I'm using a clip of it in this next slide. That's how serendipity works. So the premise is, that this woman dies and she goes to heaven. And the very first person she meets is Ted Danson. And I want you to listen. I hope it's going to be loud enough, but I want you to listen to their conversation, okay? Let me see if I can get this to work. You ready? And if it's not loud enough, I'll start it again. I just want to make sure it's quiet before I start this. Okay.
So who was right? I mean, about all of this?
Well, let's see. Hindus are a little bit right, Muslims a little bit, Jews, Christians, Buddhists. Every religion guessed about 5%, except for Doug Forsett.
Who's Doug Forsett?
Well, Doug was a stoner kid who lived in Calgary during the 1970s. One night he got really high on mushrooms, and his best friend Randy said, "Hey, what do you think happens after we die?" And Doug just launched into this long monologue where he got like 92% correct. And we couldn't believe what we were hearing. That's him, actually, right up there. He's pretty famous around here.
So, I mean, how fitting is that, right? So, again, religions, some people say that religions arose because we were so scared of death that we needed to hear, like, what's going to happen to us? We had to allay people's concerns, so we came up with these ideas that started religions around them. But it still begs the question of what exactly lives on after you die. And of course, you're probably quick, oh, the soul lives on, but not necessarily because, in Judaism, the whole body gets resurrected. So, is it the body that's going to live on eventually, or your soul, or your memories? Now, I put the idea of your memories in there because, when I talk about that you spend a lifetime refining your personality, like, listen, if you want to know who I am, you have to know what I like and what I don't like, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, what I want to do, what I don't want to do, what I believe and what I don't believe. Like, that's the way we generally define ourselves. And I joke with my undergrads. I said to them in class yesterday, look, I'm not telling you that when you go to a job interview and somebody asks you about yourself, I'm not advising you to say, well, I'm an ever-changing being and I don't define you're not going to get the job. You need to use the personality in the world. You need to say who you know, who you are, what you like, what you do. I get it. So again, I'm not asking you to give that up. But in sort of the deepest Buddhist tradition, I'd say, your sense of self is it's not the mask that we wear, but it's also not your memories. In other words, like, your memories are what we think make you you. Like, oh, well, what would I be without my memories? But it's an interesting question. Are your memories really you? Or can you live on without your memories? And, if there was an afterlife or incarnation, which one of these would you be willing to give up? And there's this, I can't find the original, I saw this in a School of Life video, and I can't find the original source, but John Locke, who was an English philosopher during the Enlightenment period, apparently and he thought a lot about the inner self. That I know is true. John Locke is sort of known for talking about introspection and the idea that you can actually turn inwards and say, like, what's happening, which was kind of revolutionary for its time, 1700s. But apparently one of the things that he would sort of talk about is, like, what's more you? Would it be more you if you could keep all of your sort of feelings and values but lose all of your memories? Is that more you? Or would it be more you if you got to keep all your memories, but I gave you a different set of feelings and values? And most people say it would feel more like them if they, forget about the memories. I don't need the memories. I just want to make sure I feel like me, like I have me here. So moving out of religions, and the last part of the lecture is about other ideas, like what else is out there. Religion tried to give us some hope in some ways, but I want to bring up a new age spin on reincarnation. And I swear, when I listen to this person, Alan Watts, you guys know who Alan Watts is? English philosopher, writer, some really good books that I've read of his when I was younger, like The Way of Zen, The Wisdom of Insecurity. He's got a whole bunch of books and a whole bunch of videos. And there's one of these videos that really struck me. And I swear when he says what I'm about to say, it just seems so true. But I feel like when I say it, I'm not, maybe I need to bring on like a thick English accent to do this. But here's what he says. He says, I'm gonna say out loud 2 sentences about what happens after you die. Ready? He says, after I die, I shall be reborn as a baby, but I shall forget my former life. In other words, no memories. All the memories go away. And here's the second sentence. After I die, a baby will be born. And then he says, these 2 sentences are saying the same thing. You know what's weird? I'm getting the chills. I'm getting the chills picturing his voice saying it, because there's something about this that is just like, good point, Alan. Like, almost all of a sudden, my fear of death went out the window. Like, if I'm already willing to accept that my death, if I am somehow coming back, is going to be without my memories, then it's fine. So then a baby's born when I die. It's the same idea. It doesn't seem so awful. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel better, folks. No one's going to walk out of here going like, oh, God, now I feel so much better about death. This is just so that we keep talking. There's an age-old spin on don't worry, be happy. I'm just curious now, there's a very ancient Greek philosopher who gets the credit for being like, don't worry, be happy. Anyone know who I'm talking about? Yep, I thought his name was pronounced Epicurus. But how do you pronounce it? Epicurus? Is that right? Is it actually Epicurus? I thought it was Epicurus only because, I'm so embarrassed to say, the reason I know about him is because there's this like cooking site called Epicurious. So I figured it was Epicurus. Anyway, he's sort of the philosopher who gets the credit of like, let's all enjoy pleasure, let's be hedonistic, let's just enjoy the simple pleasures of life, sex and good food and good wine and good friends. But he was deeper than that, and he talked about death, and he did have a sort of don't worry, be happy philosophy. He said, so death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us, but when death comes, then we do not exist. So he's like, what are you worrying about? Death? Yeah. He was a rationalist. He said, you're not going to feel death. It's not going to nobody's saying that the lead up to death isn't going to necessarily be associated with pain, but at death, you're free of pain and hurt and worries. So that's kind of, I'm not here to comfort you, but that's an interesting point of view. And I remember years ago, somebody asked me this question about deaths, which is very related to Epicurus. Are you upset that you did not exist before you were born? Because all of you were like kind of technically dead before you were born, and that's true. But that doesn't seem troubling to you, the fact that you didn't exist before. So why is it so troubling to kind of know that once again you won't exist? And again, we can talk about this all day. All of these. Oh, what's the truth? What? And I don't know the truth, and that's why I think maybe the most important part of this talk is this one, which is death as our greatest teacher about life. And you all know what I'm talking about because you're already hopefully sitting there in your seats going like, oh yeah, remember that movie or that book that once you knew you were going to die, everything became, And so just to put up a few examples that are kind of obvious ones, right? Raise your hand if you've read Tuesdays with Morrie or if you've seen the movie, right? Beautiful story about a man who knows he's dying, and he kind of deals with it with so much dignity. He shows us how to die with dignity and facing it and not having it be, a tragedy, but just a full acceptance. There's a book called The Last Lecture, and there's a wonderful talk online. Randy Pausch was a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and I think it was about almost 10 years ago that he found out he had terminal liver cancer. And he actually gave this last lecture in front of a big group of 300, and it's a beautiful speech, about the fact, look, it's about life, it's not about death. Death is just another way to remind us that we're not here forever, and that we should make the most of it. This movie, is obvious, the bucket list, what could be more, pertinent than this kind of movie? And then I'll just put up one more movie. I'm just curious, has anyone ever seen the movie The Hereafter? It's a really good movie with Matt Damon. I watched it with my mom when she was diagnosed with her terminal cancer a couple years ago. She passed away about 6 months ago. And it's really good because it's not only about near-death experiences, which I'm sure will come up in the question and answer period, and we can talk about that a little bit. Because the woman, I forgot the actress's name, but she has a near-death experience, and it's really changes her life. But the movie's a lot more than that. But one part of it is like what it's like to really see your death, to really know that it's there, not to be like, oh, well, I won't worry about that now because that's not for many, many more years, but to really understand your own death. And so there are books. There's lots out there about understanding your own death, and that does bring up, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which I also read, and just in way of history. So let me look at the time and see. I think I do have time. So there's an ancient book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And I'm just curious, has anyone tried to read that? Or you've heard of it at least? Okay, so I've never tried to read it. When you read this book, he makes reference to the original scriptures, which were written, many, many years ago, thousands of years ago, by what would be like Tibetan Buddhists, I guess roughly in the Indus Valley region, which is like between India and Pakistan. And that book was about the practice of helping somebody through the death process. And the Tibetan Buddhists believe in these things called bardos, which are different parts of your life and different parts of your death. And there's three bardos at death. And this book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead had the prayers that you would be reading to somebody either when they were dying or after they died to kind of help them with the process of rebirth and how to move through their death into rebirth. And I'm probably going to butcher this. It's my quick understanding, having read this book. So if anyone wants to correct me later, please do. But roughly speaking, the three bardos at death, according to the Tibetan Buddhists, are the following. The first bardo is that your life sort of flashes in front of you. Everything that's ever happened is there, and it kind of all makes sense. It all of a sudden, it's like a puzzle that you go like, oh, bingo, I get it. It all comes together. That's the first bardo. The second bardo is what they refer to as pure consciousness. Like, there's no narrative anymore. There's no story about your life. It's just a sense of knowing something deeper. And they talk about it as not always pleasant. It can be terrifying. It can be very pleasant, but it can also be terrifying. It's like a deep, deep understanding of the universe. And then the third bardo, this kind of makes me laugh a little bit, has a lot of sexual images in it, and that you're filled with desire. And why? Because the desire is meant to get you to go like, I want to get back in a body. Body's great. I love it. I love to have sex, and I love to eat. And it's almost to get you wanting to be a human, to be back in a body. And that would be being reborn. That would be the reincarnation cycle. Whereas if you had already learned to divorce yourself of those earthly material desires, then you might fly off into nirvana and not be reborn. So this book was written as a sort of a retelling of those original scriptures in a modern day point of view, but really emphasizing life. And so a lot of it is about, the idea that living with the reality of death makes us happier to be alive. Again, not surprising. You've all thought about that too. If you've ever had a near-death experience, or if you've ever had something where you almost got into a car accident and all of a sudden you go, oh, wow, okay, I'm going to be really appreciative for the next 10 minutes. And then I'm going to go back to my normal self, which is petty and absorbed in all sorts of things that don't matter. I mean, this is, I think I might say that in a slide or two, but maybe I'll even say it now before I forget, which is that, we all know that on our deathbed, we're going to have an epiphany where we realize that we wasted time. Now, you might say, oh, not me, I'll never. But you do. Everyone that I know who's described what it was like when they got near the end sort of says, I wish I had made amends with my brother. I wish I hadn't worked so much. I wish I hadn't worried so much. It wasn't necessary. You sort of understand at that moment that you have wasted a lot of time. And the thing is, we do all understand that now. We understand right now that we're going to have the epiphany, but yet we still spend a lot of our time wasting it being petty. And I say petty, and you might think that sounds like, well, that sounds like a pretty strong word to accuse me of, but I'm petty. If you're not petty, then you're not human. There's lots of times where you just a small little thing, you take it personally, you make an assumption about somebody else, you think you know better, you think you're right, and you're going to prove it. Gosh darn it, you're going to listen to me, and then you'll know that you're wrong. We do that. We live like that. And we know that none of it matters at the end, but we still live like that. And so the next few books that I'm going to put up here are really kind of about that concept. And one of the quotes from this book is, "We do not know where death awaits us, so let us wait for it everywhere. To practice death is to practice freedom." To really understand your death and to really understand the fact that you're not what you think you are, which is a crazy thing to say to an audience of people who have spent a whole life defining who they are. And I know that sounds provocative, but it's true. And at least it's true on some level. It's true on some level. I'll come back to that. One more book, Carlos Castaneda books. Somebody stopped me, Dale stopped me before. He's like, oh, death over the left shoulder. And this Don Juan, this Yaqui Indian who was kind of another enlightened being, he's one. We do think about the fact that throughout human history, there have been enlightened beings. There are people who really deeply understand their death, really understand that the body and the personality in the mask is all impermanent. And so they don't spend a lifetime trying to build a mask that's going to go anyway. They spend a lifetime trying to deeply connect with their essence, with their symbolic self, with their divine, with their true self. And these people do walk our planet. And everybody's, if you think of it as back to the Hindu and Buddhist tradition of birth and death cycles, you'd say, well, you look at it, different people, and you go like, oh, that person's pretty close to enlightened. Oh, gosh, that person's nowhere near it. And the idea is that you have to keep coming back so that you get a little closer to enlightenment each time, that you get a little bit more clear from an early age as opposed to on your deathbed that you are not who you think you are, that you're not this list of, the list of things on your resume. It's a purpose, it's a mask, it's got a function, but it's not who you are. And so Don Juan was one of these kind of enlightened beings. And his point is, death is stalking you over your left shoulder. It's always there. And in his teachings to Carlos, his student, he talks a lot about conferring with death. Like, ask death, what do you think? So here's a nice line. The thing to do when you are impatient is to turn to your left and ask advice from your death. An immense amount of pettiness is dropped if your death makes a gesture to you, or if you catch a glimpse of it, or if you just have the feeling that your companion is there watching you. Death is a wise advisor that we have. One has to ask death's advice and drop the cursed pettiness that belongs to men that live their lives as if death will never tap them. So this is the last book that I want to mention. And, I could come back and give a lecture on this book. Probably almost every slide I could come back and give a lecture on if you wanted me to. This is a wonderful book. I'm just curious if anyone's read it. Okay. And throughout this book, Eckhart Tolle talks about the death of the ego and the death of the present moment. And he talks about it as readying us for the death of the body. He gives us, so again, this is a whole lecture, and maybe I can try to, summarize the book in just a minute or two. We define ourselves by a lot of things, by the way we look, by what we like and what we don't like, what we want, what we don't want, what we believe in, what we don't believe in, what we think is right, what we think is wrong. And we cling to what he calls mental positions. We think, well, I'm a smart person. I've got it right. And if you could just listen to me, you'll see you're wrong. It's this way we act all the time in everything, from politics to relationships. It's all over the place. This is the pettiness that I'm talking about, that we really think that we're right, and it's just a matter of convincing somebody else. And I definitely think humans have different preferences, no doubt. And that's a word I'll use in my workshops. You know, we're different. We have different preferences. And yes, we have to come up with laws and clear conversations between two people so that we can negotiate given our different preferences. I'm not saying that you stop any of that. All of that has to happen. But to think that your preference is right is kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy. And I can give you example after example, and you wouldn't even have to agree with me about the preference, but you would just, all I'd have to say is, well, in this culture, that's okay. That culture, it's not. Right? Boom, right there. There's no right answer. It's what you're used to. It's what you're familiar with. It doesn't mean you're right. It doesn't mean your preference is right. But our world doesn't talk like that. We talk about mental positions, and you just have to listen to my argument, and then you'll see I'm right. And that's your ego. It's your mind, and the mind is a beautiful thing. The mind should be used to have a clear conversation with somebody else and be clear about, listen, I'm just wondering, my preference is that we always eat dinner on time. Well, my preference is that we have more flexibility. Well, what can we, the mind is great for that, but what happens is we decide that a position that we have is who we are. And if you believe that a position that you take is who you are, then guess what happens if you're wrong? You die. It's like death. That's how Eckhart Tolle talks about you're clinging to your mental positions. As if to say, you're clinging to them because you think they're you, and therefore, oh no, if I'm wrong, I'm dead. It feels like death. And so out the book, he talks a lot about not attaching to your mental positions. They're just your preference. And then it's that letting go. It's that letting go process all the time in life. From the clinging that we do, that's the death of the ego, of letting it go, really letting it go, because it's all going to go anyway in that last few breaths. It's going to go anyway. It's not who you are. And again, I could talk about this all day, and anyone who's taken my Principles of Clarity class knows that we really get into that. We really talk about that. And there's a great quote about death. He says, "Death is a stripping away of all that is not you. The secret of life is to die before you die and find that there is no death." To die before you die. And he's not the first person. A lot of the heavy hitters talk about that the only way to really find yourself is to let go, is to lose yourself. And that's why, all of those kind of, like Est, remember when Est was really big in the 60s, and some people hated it, they were so mean to me, and it changed. They realized that they were too harsh. But what they were trying to do is get you in the forum, the landmark, which is the newer version of Est, is still all about kind of getting you to let go of the strong idea of who you are and that you should know. Do you know who I am? I mean, people talk like that. I talk like that. I admit I actually want you to think that I'm important and that I give talks around the world and that I'm a somebody. I'll even sometimes use the doctor when I go up to I'm Dr. Dobkins when I go to get, change my airline seat. I do shit like that. I'm telling you. So this is what I mean. But I do also deeply know that that's not me. I do understand that I'm playing a bit of a game. And what I want for myself, and I wish for everybody here, is that you get sort of more in touch with your divine. More in touch with your divine. And one more thing I want to say about this slide is that I was wondering if I was going to talk about this. Eckhart Tolle does talk about what happens at death. And he talks about a portal that opens and gives you an opportunity. It's very much like nirvana. So Eckhart Tolle also talks about the death and birth cycle, and that you have a chance at the time of death to live eternally in eternal consciousness, is what he calls it, that your consciousness lives eternally. And he doesn't exactly say where it goes or something like that, but he does a nice job of saying, look, you have a whole lifetime to practice death of the ego, so that when it comes time to actually die, it's not so horrible, because you were never your body anyway. You were never even your mind anyway. So if you spend a whole lifetime practicing the giving up what you think is you, giving up your mental positions, not giving up, it doesn't mean that you don't have a good political argument with somebody. It doesn't mean that you sit and meditate every day. It means that when you're having that political argument with somebody, you deeply understand that it's a difference of opinion, it's a different preference, it's not who you are. Being right is not that important. So he says that you have a whole lifetime to practice that letting go so that you're ready for death. But the good news is that even if you didn't spend a whole lifetime practicing the letting go, at the moment of death, if you kind of see the portal, if you just sort of in that moment have that awakening of like, consciousness, this is, whoa, I'm alive, this is happening, I'm immense, I'm ethereal, that you actually pass through. He says if you don't, you end up basically coming back, to this planet. You get another try. So again, I'm not going to weigh in on what happens, but it's beautiful, and when you listen to him tell it, it really feels, really profound. So, are we ready to talk about death? I want to talk about death with you in the hour that we have, and I want to tell you two little stories before we end. So, there was a military leader in England in like the 50s. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, Sir Roderick MacLeod. And apparently, he was at a dinner party with a bunch of people, and the hostess went around. She said, "I'm just curious, what do each of you think happens when you die?" And different people gave, I think you go to heaven, or I'm not really sure, I believe in reincarnation. And when it was coming to his turn, he said something that's hilarious. Now, I hope you see why this is ironic, what he said. It gives you a sense of us not knowing how to talk about death and being uncomfortable with it. So here's his response to what do you think happens. "When I die, I shall go to heaven and enjoy endless bliss. But I wish to not indulge in such a depressing conversation." So right there, it's like, well, wait a minute, why, And so I'll just end by, this is me in college. So you learned when I was 7 or 8, I lied in bed and contemplated death. When I was 18, I thought about how we package death in this pretty way that didn't make sense to me. And then when I got into college, and to this very day, I like to ask people a question that makes them uncomfortable, and I don't know why. I like to ask people, when you die, would you rather go instantaneously? Would you rather, be hit by a bus or get a heart attack or even die in your sleep, which most people pick, but we can come back to dying in your sleep in a minute. But in a sense, meaning like that you don't know you're dying. Would you rather not know it? Or would you rather have some kind of illness that gives you time to think about it and contemplate it before you die? And again, I've been asking people this since I was in college, and people get well, that's pretty private. What, it's like my class of going how dare you? And I'm always like, why? Why are you, and please, I wouldn't, if somebody says, I don't want to talk about it, I let it go, but I'm so curious why it's such a, so sort of a faux pas to ask that. So I'm going to end there, and we'll take a break, and we'll talk more. Thank you.